Hi, my name is Leslie Vernick, and I have written a brand new book called The Emotionally Destructive Marriage: How to Find Your Voice and Reclaim Your Hope. Each week, I hope to share with you just some short teaching from the book in anticipation of its release date. And today, I want to talk about some common misunderstandings of headship and submission that sometimes seem to justify or even excuse abusive behaviors. For example, during a counseling session, one of my clients said to me, "I've always been taught submission trumps everything, even my own children. But when he's raging out of control, screaming and threatening them, and their scared little faces look to me for help, what am I supposed to do? Does God want me to support my husband and stand by him and ignore what's happening because he's the head of our home?" The New Testament never describes godly headship or leadership by using an authoritarian power over model. Jesus actually demonstrated headship for his disciples so that they would be crystal clear what he meant. And instead of wielding his mighty authority or rightful power to show them what leadership looked like, he donned a towel and a basin and he personally washed each one of their dirty feet. They were the future leaders of his church, and Jesus wanted to show them that biblical headship meant sacrificial servanthood. Neither Jesus nor the scriptures ever describe biblical headship or leadership as entitlement to do what you want, demand that others do what you want, or to get your own way. The correct biblical terms for those characteristics are selfishness, misuse of one's power, and bullying. And there are numerous biblical examples of these behaviors throughout scriptures, but they are never depicted as God's example for leadership, but rather as sin. Now, after Jesus finished washing the disciples' feet, he said to them, "If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to also wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do as I have done to you." Now, this concept of selfless servanthood was so radically different of the disciples' idea of leadership that they didn't truly grasp what Jesus meant. Later on, James and John were arguing about who was going to get the best seat in heaven when Jesus stopped them and taught them the essence of biblical headship. He said, "You know those Gentiles? You know the rulers of the Gentiles? They lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it should not be among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be a slave of all." Jesus expressly warned his leaders not to abuse their power just to get their own way, or boss people around. And what Jesus taught was so unheard of in Jewish culture, people quite didn't get it. You see, hierarchy was well established even in the most intimate relationships. Men dominated women, husbands their wives. And Paul picked up Jesus' heart on the matter when he writes about marriage. "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." The essence of biblical teaching on headship is that if you're the head, if you're the leader, you have the responsibility to initiate and model servanthood before anyone else in the family does so. As a leader, you get to show the way. You're to go first. And so whether it's a leader in a home or a church or even a nation, manipulates, threatens, and scares people into doing what he wants or to do what he says, know that he's not behaving as a biblical head, but rather as a bully. Now, Jesus didn't only model headship for us, he also modeled submission. In the Garden of Gethsemane, anticipating the crucifixion, Jesus prayed that this cup of suffering would be removed from him. He dreaded the cross. He wanted God to find an alternative way to save humankind, and yet Jesus submitted himself when he prayed, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Now, throughout Jesus' life, he always described himself as doing what God wanted. He says his will was synonymous with what God's will was. But now, in this agonizing moment, during his garden prayer, Jesus felt differently. This was the first time he didn't want to do what God wanted, but he chose to submit to God's will and his Father's perfect plan. God did not force Jesus to submit. Jesus chose to. Jesus himself said, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." In the same way, biblical submission can never be forced. It can only be done by the one who chooses to submit his or her will to another. And so when we voluntarily give our will to another or to God, it's called submission. And when someone forces us to give our will, It's not called biblical submission. The correct term is coercion, intimidation, or bullying. And submission isn't necessarily agreement, it's yielding your will for a greater good. The good might be unity in the family, or even in the family of God, or just honoring and pleasing God. Now, Jesus modeled both headship and submission for us in volunteering for the servant's place and yielding his will to God. And this describes the working together of headship and submission, the husband sacrificially leading his wife in servanthood through example, and the wife sacrificially yielding her will in servanthood through her example. Both are servants of the other, as well as servants of God. But when only one is a servant and the other plays God or acts like the master, then the marriage isn't working as God intended. Now, since the fall of Adam and Eve, human beings have been vying for power and control over one another, Genesis tells us. But this was not God's original plan, but the result of sin. And biblical headship doesn't mean you get your way all the time or get to make the final decision and every choice. And submission doesn't mean that you have no power, no voice, or no choice in things. The scriptures validate the mutuality of marriage and the dignity and value of each individual, no matter who they are. As Paul plainly wrote in Galatians, now there is no difference between Jew and Gentile, slave and free, man or woman. We may have different roles and responsibilities as husbands and wives, but one is not over the other. Mutuality of servanthood, submission, and sacrifice are the biblical model for the Trinity and for godly relationships, including marriage. Now, next week, I'm going to show you why trying harder in the traditional wifely way of being more submissive can actually make your destructive marriage worse. So see you then. God bless.